In the autumn of 1887, on a mud bank below the bluffs of the Missouri River where it bends past the dwindling town of Carroll Landing in Dakota Territory, a young woman of 28 stood at the foot of a dead steamboat and counted out $2 silver into the open palm of a man who could not stop laughing. The boat was a sidewheel packet called the Esteline, half sunk and wholly forsaken, her hull driven into the silt at a list so steep her main deck sloped toward the water like a roof. She had been there 11 years. The river had taken her in a spring flood, and the river had never given her back, and the men of Carroll Landing had long ago stripped her of anything that could be carried off and sold. What remained was rot and rust and the long silence of a thing nobody wanted. The woman's name was Della Hart, and she was buying the wreck. The agent who took her money represented the bank that held the salvage lien, and he had come downriver expecting to spend a tedious afternoon and instead found a buyer for a property the bank had written down to nothing. $2 was the figure he had been authorized to accept from anyone foolish enough to ask. He had not believed anyone would ask. He was a soft-handed man in a town coat and good boots that the mud was already ruining, and he had brought a clerk's satchel and a folding stool that he did not get to use. And 3 idlers from the landing had drifted down to the bank to watch, because a stranger buying the dead boat was the most interesting thing to happen at Carroll Landing in a season. When Della folded the receipt and put it in the worn leather satchel at her hip, the agent told her, still grinning, that she now owned the only house on the river a person could drown inside of. One of the idlers laughed and said she had paid $1 too much. Another said she had bought herself 11 years of other men's bad luck. Della did not answer any of them. She was looking past the agent at the boat, reading the slope of the deck and the place where the stairs would have been, already 3 days ahead of the men who were laughing at her. What he did not know, what none of them at the landing knew, was that Della had not come for the timber, or the brass, or the iron. She had come for a door. There was a stateroom on the Texas deck of the Esteline that had been locked for 11 years, locked from the day the boat went down, and the men who had stripped the wreck had broken into every cabin but that one. They told a story about it in Carroll Landing, the way river towns tell stories, half memory and half warning. They said the captain had died with his back against that door. They said he had refused to leave it, and they said that whatever he had been protecting was still inside, behind a lock that 3 different men with 3 different bars had failed to force, and that the man who finally opened it would either find a fortune or find nothing, and either way would have cost a dead man to do it. Stay with me, because the truth was stranger than the story, and quieter, and it had been waiting 11 years for the right pair of hands. Della had those hands. She had been raised in a lockmaker's shop in St. Louis, the only child of a German immigrant named Otto Reinhold, who made strongbox locks and safe wards for the river trade, and who had taken her into the work the way other men took their sons. By the time she was 12, she could file a key blank to a ward she had only felt with a pick. By the time she was 20, she understood locks the way a doctor understands a body, as a thing with an inside and a logic and a history of injury. Otto had died of a lung fever the winter she turned 26, and he had left her his bench, his tools, and a single piece of advice she carried the way other people carry scripture. A lock is not a wall, he used to say. A lock is a question, and every question has an answer that fits it. You do not break the door. You ask it correctly. She had come to Carroll Landing because of a name. Among Otto's papers after he died, she had found a ledger of his commissions going back 30 years, and in it, dated the spring of 1875, was an entry for a custom warded lock and an iron-bound trunk, commissioned by a riverboat captain named Josiah Vare, master of the packet Esteline. The trunk and the lock had been built to Otto's own design, the entry said, and paid in full and delivered to the boat at the St. Louis levee. A year and some months later, the Esteline had gone down at Carroll Landing with Vere aboard, and the trunk had never been recovered. And Della, reading her dead father's hand in the lamplight, had understood that somewhere on a sunken boat in Dakota Territory was a lock that her own father had made, sealing a thing a man had died beside. She did not yet know what was in the trunk. She knew only that her father had built the door to it, and that she was the only person living who knew how he built his doors. The first night she slept in a borrowed room above the Carroll Landing feed store, the smell of grain and dust coming up through the floorboards, and in the morning she walked down to the river before the town was awake. The Esteline lay in the gray light like the carcass of some great animal that had lain down in the shallows to die. 11 years of weather had bleached her upper works to the color of bone, and the gilt scrollwork along her rail had gone black, and a young cottonwood had taken root in the silt that filled her forward hold and grown taller than a man. The river moved past her without hurry. Della stood on the bank and read the boat the way she read everything, from the outside in, learning its injuries before she touched it. The list to starboard, the stove planking amidships where the ice had worked at her for 11 winters, the Texas deck up top, narrow and high, where the officers' cabins had been, and where one door among them had held shut against every man who tried it. She could not see that door yet. She could see the deck it was on, though, and she began, standing on the mud in the cold, to plan her way up to it. She would need help, and help on the frontier is not given to a stranger for the asking. The man who finally gave it was an old riverman named Asa Good, who had pulled freight on the Missouri for 40 years, and who lived now in a tar paper shack at the edge of the landing with a one-eyed dog and a memory that went back further than anyone else in town. Asa had been on the river the night the Esteline went down. He had seen the lights of her go under. When Della found him mending a net on his step and told him she had bought the wreck, he looked at her for a long moment and then said that she had bought a grave and that graves were better left alone. She told him she did not believe the boat was a grave. She believed it was a strong box, and she had come to open it. Something in the way she said it, level and without heat, made the old man set his net down. He asked her what she knew about the captain. She told him what the ledger said, the trunk and the lock in her father's hand. Asa was quiet a while, working a frayed strand of the net between his fingers, and then he told her the part the town did not tell, because the town did not know it. He had crewed 2 seasons under Josiah Vere, and Vere had not been a hard man, though he had become a closed one in his last year. There had been a partner, Asa said, a man named Royce Tatum, who owned the other half of the Esteline and most of the warehouses at Carroll Landing besides, and who in the spring before the wreck had begun to squeeze the captain in ways a deckhand only half understood. Money had gone missing from the boat's accounts. Vere had been blamed for it. And in the last weeks before she sank, Vere had taken to keeping something locked in his stateroom that he would let no one near, and had told Asa once, in the pilot house late at night, that he was holding the only honest thing left on the river, and that he meant to hold it until he could put it in front of a judge. Asa had not understood it then. He had been young, and a captain's troubles were a captain's troubles, and he had gone on coiling rope and minding the boilers and thinking the matter would settle itself the way most matters did. It had not settled. The river had settled it instead. The judge never came. The flood came instead. And Royce Tatum, Asa said, had collected the insurance on the boat as the surviving owner, and had bought up the captain's good name for the price of a rumor, and had died rich in his bed 9 years later, an old man respected in 3 counties. His grandson held the warehouses now. The Tatum name was on the bank, on the freight company, on the church. Asa said all this without heat, the way a man states the weather, and then he said the thing that decided him. He said that he had always believed Josiah Vare was an honest man wronged, and that he had carried that belief alone for 11 years because there had never been a way to prove it, and that he had grown old waiting for someone to come who could, and that if Della Hart thought there was a way into that stateroom, he would carry her tools to the boat himself. They began the next morning. Getting aboard was its own labor, and the river gave nothing easily. The main deck sloped too steeply to climb from the bank, so Asa rigged a plank stage from the bow of the wreck to a stand of willows on the shore, and across this narrow bridge they carried what Della needed. She had brought her father's tools from St. Louis in a fitted wooden case, and she carried it across the plank herself, balanced and unhurried, because she trusted no other hands with it. Inside were the picks and the tension wrenches and the fine files, the small brass-handled tools worn smooth by Otto's grip, and now by hers, and the one tool that mattered most, a thing her father had called the reader, a slender instrument for feeling the depth and order of the wards inside a lock she could not see. She set the case down on the canted deck and looked up at the Texas, 3 decks above her, and began to climb toward the door. The climb took the better part of 2 days because the stairs were rotten and had to be shored before they would bear weight, and Asa would not let her go up an inch that he had not tested first. They worked in the cold with the river talking below them. The forward stair had pulled half away from its mounting, and they braced it with cottonwood poles cut from the stand on the bank, and Asa drove the poles home with the flat of an old maul while Della held them true, and twice a tread gave way under his weight before he was ready for it, and he caught himself on the rail and said nothing, because a man who has spent 40 years on the water learns early not to waste breath cursing it. On the second afternoon they reached the Texas deck, and Della walked its narrow length past the broken-in cabins, the doors hanging on single hinges, the little rooms inside stripped to the studs and silted with 11 years of mud and leaves. A wren had nested in one of them and flew out past her face and was gone over the river. And at the end of the row she came to the door that was still shut. It did not look like much. It was a plain stateroom door of white pine, gone gray, swollen in its frame, and set into it at the height of a man's hand was a lock plate of blackened brass, square and heavy, and clearly not original to the boat. It was her father's work. She knew it the way you know a familiar face across a crowded room, before you have named a single feature. The escutcheon was Otto's pattern, the small 5-lobed flower he stamped into every plate he made, his maker's mark, the thing he put on his work in place of his name. Della stood before the door and put her bare hand flat against the brass, and the metal was cold as the river, and she felt, standing there, the strange doubled grief of a daughter who has found her dead father's hand laid on the thing she has crossed 1,000 miles to reach. The men who came before her had seen a lock and tried to break it. She saw a question her father had asked, and she had been raised to answer it. Have you ever found, in the most unlikely place, some small proof that a person you lost was real and skilled and present in the world? Hold that feeling. It is the whole of what Della felt with her palm on the brass. Then she opened her case and went to work. The lock did not yield easily, and it was not meant to. Otto Reinhold had built it to defeat exactly the kind of men who had already tried it, the men with bars and brute force, and it had defeated them. Against patience it was a different thing. Della worked the first day by feel alone. The reader slid into the keyway, learning the lock the way her father had taught her, ward by ward, asking it the question and listening for the answer in the faint click and drag of metal she could feel but not see. The cold made her fingers clumsy, and she warmed them in her armpits and went back to it. Asa sat near with a lantern as the light failed and asked her nothing. because he had watched her face and understood that talk would not help. Once, near dark, he set a tin cup of coffee on the deck at her elbow, and she did not touch it until it had gone cold, and she drank it cold without seeming to notice, and went on. The wards were fouled with 11 years of river damp, and the rust had married the parts together, and she had to free each one before she could read the next. She brushed each with a fine oil from a little cork bottle, and waited while it crept into the seized metal, and worked the ward a hair at a time, and waited again. On the second day the reader caught and would not turn, and she drew it out and saw that a fleck of rust had broken loose and fouled the works, and she spent 4 hours clearing what she had spent the morning loosening, and she did not let it hurry her. She did not force a single piece. To force one was to break it, and to break it was to lose the answer. On the third day the lock spoke to her. She had cleared the last of the rust from the final ward, and she set the reader aside and took up a key blank she had been filing down for 2 days to the shape the lock had told her, cutting it deeper each time the lock refused, reading her error in the scratch marks the wards left on the soft brass, filing again. Her hands were cut in 3 places from the file in the cold, and she had bound them with strips torn from a clean rag, and she filed through the binding more than once. She fitted the blank into the keyway. She turned it with the steady, even pressure her father had drilled into her hands 10,000 times, the pressure of a question asked correctly, and the bolt drew back with a long iron groan that ran the length of the dead boat like a held breath let go. The door was open. It had been shut for 11 years, and a daughter's hands had asked it the question her father built into it, and it had answered her, because that was what it had been made to do. Asa Good, who had said at the start that she had bought a grave, stood up slowly in the lantern light and said, in a voice gone rough, that he had watched 3 strong men fail at that door with iron bars, and that he had just watched a woman open it with a sliver of steel, and 3 days of refusing to be in a hurry. Inside the stateroom the air was cold and close, and smelled of cedar and river silt. The room had been sealed well enough that the water had not had its full way with it. A narrow berth, a washstand, a captain's writing desk bolted to the wall, and against the inner bulkhead, where a dying man might have set his back to it, an iron-bound trunk of dark oak with corners of riveted strap iron, and set into its lid, a second lock plate stamped with the same 5-lobed flower. Della stood in the doorway and did not go to it at once. She had crossed the country for this trunk, and now that it was an arm's length away, she found she wanted to do it rightly, slowly, the way a thing 11 years in coming deserved. Asa came to the door behind her and saw the trunk and took off his hat, an old riverman's reflex before the dead, and said quietly that this was where they had found the captain. His body had been here, against this trunk, when the water finally let men back aboard. They had taken him out and buried him on the bluff. The trunk they had left because no one could open it, and after a while no one wanted to. The second lock was a smaller cousin of the first, and Della had its measure in a single afternoon, because her hands now carried the grammar of her father's design, and the trunk lock was written in the same hand. When the lid came up, the hinges shrieked and then gave, and the cedar lining had done its slow, patient work, and what lay inside was dry. On the top was a captain's coat, folded, the brass buttons green, a faint smell of the man still in the wool, or so it seemed to her in that cold room. Beneath it was an oilcloth packet bound in tarred twine, the twine still sound, the knots tied by a careful hand that had expected to untie them himself. Beneath that, wrapped each in flannel against the damp, were the things Josiah Voyer had died protecting, and they were not gold, and they were not jewels. and they were worth more than either to the only people they could still reach. Della lifted each bundle out and set it on the berth and unwrapped it where she knelt, and Asa held the lantern close, and neither of them spoke, because some discoveries are louder for being made in silence. They were papers. The oilcloth packet held the true account books of the Esteline, the captain's own ledger kept in his own hand, double-entered against the boat's official accounts, and pressed between the pages were the bank drafts and the signed receipts that showed where the missing money had truly gone. It hadn't gone to Josiah Vare. It had gone, draft by draft over a year and a half, into accounts held by Royce Tatum, who had bled the boat he half-owned and arranged the books so that the captain's name took the loss. Each draft was small enough on its own to pass unremarked, a freight payment here, a fuel account there. But the captain had set them in their order and totaled them at the foot of the column, and the total was a number that no honest explanation could reach. Vare had seen it, and had gathered the proof draft by draft, and had locked it in a trunk behind a door no ordinary man could open, and had meant to lay it before a judge. And under the ledgers, wrapped separately, were other papers, older, that made the cold room colder. They were deeds. They were a sheaf of original land patents and a register of names, the homestead claims of 24 families who had settled the bottomlands east of Carrow Landing in the years just after the war, families who had been told when the Tatum Freight Company bought up the river frontage that their patents were void and their filings lost in a courthouse fire. The patents had not burned. Josiah Vare had been holding them. Where he had gotten them, Della could not at first tell, but the register was in his hand, and beside each name he had written a date and a note, and the notes were a record of a slow theft dressed as commerce. A man's quiet attempt to gather back the proof of what his partner had taken from people who had nothing. One note, beside a name near the bottom of the register, read only that the man had come to the boat to beg for work after losing the ground, and had not known he was begging from the only person in the territory trying to get it back for him. Della sat on the floor of the stateroom with the papers in her lap and the river moving below, and she understood that she had not opened a strongbox. She had opened a witness. The captain had not died protecting treasure. He had died protecting the testimony of the wronged, and he had built his case in iron and oak and her father's brass because paper was the only weapon a falsely accused man had against a wealthy one, and he had trusted the lock to hold his case until an honest court could hear it. The court had never come. The lock had held, though. It had held for 11 years against every hand but the one its maker had trained, and now that hand had the captain's witness in its keeping, and the question was no longer how to open the trunk. The question was what an honest person does with the truth a dead man died to save. She took none of it for herself. This is the part of the story that the town would later find hardest to believe, that a woman who had spent her last dollars to buy a wreck took nothing out of it that would make her rich, because there was nothing in it that was hers to take, and a great deal in it that belonged to other people. The ledgers belonged to the memory of Josiah Vare. The deeds belonged to the families whose names were written beside them. Della carried the papers down off the boat wrapped in her own shawl against the damp, and she did not go to the bank, and she did not go to the Tatum freight office, and she did not go to the church where the Tatum name was carved over the door. She went to Asa Good's tar paper shack, and she spread the papers on his table by lantern light, and she asked him a single question. She asked him whose names these were. Asa knew most of them. He had been 40 years on this river, and he had watched the bottomland families come and go, and he could put a face to 2/3 of the names in the captain's register, and where the family had moved on, he knew who would know. There was a name he stopped at for a long time, a man called Eli Forsyth, who had farmed the bottoms and lost the farm and gone to working another man's land, and whose granddaughter, Asa said, still lived 8 miles upriver and took in washing to keep her grandfather, who was very old now and had never stopped saying the land had been stolen and had never been believed. Della looked at the date beside the Forsyth name and the note in the captain's hand, and she said that they would go to her first. The granddaughter's name was Verna Forsyth, and she was a spare, suspicious young woman near Della's own age who met them at her door with her sleeves pushed up and her hands red from the washtub and no patience for strangers. Behind her, through the open door, steam rose off a copper boiler, and a line of other people's shirts hung drying across the one room, and an old man sat near the stove with a blanket over his knees and his face turned toward the light as if he were waiting for someone who never came. She had been told things her whole life by people who wanted something, and she expected these two to be more the same. She told them plainly that she had no money and no time, and that if they were selling, she was not buying. Della did not argue with her and did not plead. She laid the original patent on the washing table, the paper Eli Forsyth had filed 30 years before, the paper a Tatum clerk had told him burned in a fire that never happened, and she set beside it the captain's register open to the line that bore his name, and she said only that these had been kept safe by a man who died keeping them, and that they were the Forsyths to do with as they saw fit. Verna Forsyth looked down at the paper with her grandfather's name on it in her grandfather's hand, the filing he had described to her 100 times, and that she had half believed was a story an old man told himself. And she put her red, wet hand flat on it, the way Della had put her hand on the brass, and for a while she could not speak at all. Then she turned to the old man by the stove and said, very quietly, that the paper was here, that it had been found, and the old man's hands began to shake on the blanket, and he asked her to read him the date, and she read it, and he nodded as though a thing he had carried for 30 years had finally been set down. There was no confrontation. The story did not turn on one, and the niche of the thing does not require it, and the truth, when it is heavy enough, does not need a raised voice to do its work. What it needed was a lawyer, and the nearest honest one was a circuit attorney named Hollis, who rode through Carrow Landing twice a year, and who, when Della and Verna and old Asa laid the captain's trunk before him in the spring, went very quiet, and then very still, and then asked, in the careful voice of a man who has just understood that he is holding something that will change the shape of a county, where this had been kept. Della told him, on a sunken boat, behind a locked door, for 11 years. Hollis was a lean man with ink on his fingers and a way of reading a page twice before he spoke, and he read the captain's ledger through once and then again, and he laid the bank drafts out on the table in their order, and he matched each draft to its entry without a word, his finger moving down the column. When he was done, he sat back and turned the captain's ledger over in his hands and said that he had seen men hang on less proof than this, and that no man would hang now because the man who did the thing was 11 years dead, but that a great deal of property had changed hands on the strength of a lie, and that the law, slow as it was, had a long memory when you put the proof in front of it. He asked Della what she wanted out of it for herself. She told him she wanted the captain's name cleared, and the family's ground returned, and nothing besides, and Hollis looked at her for a long moment the way the agent on the bank had looked at her, except that the lawyer was not laughing. The proof went in front of it. It took the better part of 2 years, and Della was not at the center of most of it, because she did not want to be, and because the case did not need her once the papers were filed. She had asked the question correctly. The papers did the rest. The land patents were honored one by one, the void filings reinstated, the families on the captain's register found and notified, some still on the bottomland working ground they had been told was not theirs, some scattered to other counties in other states, traced by the circuit attorney's clerks down the long thread of frontier addresses. There were 24 names in the captain's register, and Hollis found 19 of the families or their heirs, and of the 5 he could not find, he set the ground aside under the court's keeping. Against the day a descendant might come forward, because the captain had written the names down, and a name written down was a debt the law could not pretend away. The Tatum holdings, built draft by draft on stolen frontage and a dead man's ruined name, came apart not in a single dramatic hour, but the way such things truly come apart, slowly in courtrooms, under the weight of paper that could not be argued with. The grandson who held the name was never met by Della in any room. He hired his own lawyers, and his lawyers read the captain's ledger and the bank's own drafts in the captain's own careful columns, and after a time they advised him to settle what could be settled and surrender what could not, because there is no argument against a man's own bank drafts laid in their order. He was undone by the ledgers his grandfather had not been able to find, and he became, in the end, a small thing the county stopped speaking of. And that was all the answer he was given. Josiah Vare's name was the part Della cared most to set right, because it was the part with no living mouth to speak for it. The circuit attorney filed to clear the captain of the theft he had been blamed for, and the filing was granted. And one cold morning the town of Carrow Landing took the marker down from the cheap, nameless grave on the bluff where they had buried a man they thought a thief, and set a new stone, and on it cut his name, and his rank, and the name of his boat. Della paid for the stone. It was the one thing she spent the wreck's truth on, and she did not let anyone else carry the cost. A fair number of the town came up the bluff that morning, more than she had expected. Some of the same men who had laughed on the bank the day she bought the boat, standing now with their hats in their hands, having learned by then what the woman who could not move her purchase had moved instead. She stood at the grave the morning they set the stone with Asa beside her and Verna Forsythe beside her, and she did not make a speech, because the captain had not died for speeches. She had brought one thing to leave at the grave. It was her father's reader, the slender instrument he had taught her to listen with, and she pressed it a little way into the earth at the foot of the new stone, because the two men had never met, and yet had built between them, across years and miles and death, the thing that finally let the truth out, and she felt that the tool belonged with the lock it had finally answered. Asa asked her once, near the end, whether she was sorry she had spent her last dollars on a thing that made her no richer than she had been. They were standing on the bank below the Esteline in the long light of an autumn evening, the second autumn now, and the boat lay where it had always lain, and the cottonwood in her forward hold had put on another year's growth. Della watched the river a while before she answered. She said that her father had told her a lock was a question, and that every question had an answer that fitted, and that she had begun to think a life was the same. She said the captain had asked a question with his death, and had trusted that someday the right hands would come and answer it, and that she had been those hands, and that this was worth more than money to a person who had spent her whole life learning to open what other people had given up on. Asa nodded slowly and did not say anything, because there was nothing to add, and the one-eyed dog leaned against his leg, and the river went on by. Della did not stay in Carrow Landing. The wreck was hers, and she signed it over to Verna Forsythe and the Bottomland families to do with as they liked, and they left it where it lay, because a boat that had held the truth that long had earned the right to lie in peace, and because the cottonwood growing in her hold had become, without anyone deciding it, a kind of marker that the town learned to nod toward. Verna asked her, the morning she left, why she would not take even a small share for herself, after the months and the cut hands, and the last of her money spent on a thing the whole town had laughed at. Della told her that she had not opened the door to be paid. She had opened it because she had been the only one who could, and because a debt that can be paid and is not is a heavier thing to carry than an empty purse. Verna walked with her down to the landing in the early light and stood on the bank while the packet took her aboard, and neither of them said much, because the kind of thing that had passed between them did not lean on words. Then Della went back down the river the way she had come, on the deck of a packet that still ran the route the Esteline had once run, with her father's tools in their fitted case balanced on her knees, one instrument fewer in the velvet than when she had come, and the empty slot in the case where the reader had lain was, she found, the only thing she had taken out of the whole affair that she would keep forever, an absence in the shape of the thing that had finally answered. Years later, the people who had been children at Carrow Landing in 1887 told the story to their own children, and the story changed in the telling the way river stories do, and in some versions the trunk had held gold after all, and in some the woman had been a captain's daughter, and in some she had vanished up the river and was never heard of again. The families on the bottom land kept the true version, though, the one in which a woman bought a worthless wreck for $2 silver and opened a door that had killed 3 men's pride, and gave away everything she found inside, and asked nothing, and left only a small steel tool in the ground at the foot of a stone that had a captain's right name on it at last. They kept that version because it was theirs, because they were standing on the proof of it. The bottom land ground that was theirs again, because a dead man had hidden the deeds, and a living woman had known how to ask the lock for them. If this story moved something in you, sit with the memory of someone who kept faith in a truth no one else would carry. That is the whole of what this was about. On the bluff above the river, the new stone weathered slowly into the place, as if it had always been there, and the reader at its foot went dark with rust, the way all iron does in the end, sinking a little deeper each spring with the rain, until it was as much a part of the ground as the roots of the grass. The Esteline lay below in her silt, bone-gray and patient, the door on her Texas deck standing open now to the weather for the first time in 11 years, and the river that had taken her and kept her and hidden her went on past the bluff and the stone and the open door, carrying the autumn light downstream the way it always had, in no hurry at all, toward the country where the families it had once cheated were planting again on ground that bore their names.